Uh, Hello, everybody. Very good to see you at whatever time of day it is for you. And really, thanks for people who are introducing themselves. And as I think you can see if you're following the chat, we've got quite an interesting set of people here, and we've got a really interesting session for you. I hope you're going to enjoy it. I'm Dan Corrie. I'm the Chief Executive of New Philanthropy Capital, and I'll say a little bit more about us in a second. Just to go through first the housekeeping things, mainly which are up on that slide, which you can see. So just to run through it, Zoom etiquette, do put yourself on mute when you're not speaking, put questions in the chat. The event is being recorded, and I think we may have journalists or at least bloggers who are listening. So, you know, if there's something you don't want to say too publicly, don't say it. We've got closed captions working at the moment. You can see down the bottom. If you want to turn them off, I'm told that you go to the three dots, I think, in the toolbar, and there's options to turn them off if they're getting annoying you. We have a hashtag for the event if you are a kind of Twitter type person, NPC events. So do tweet away. Just to introduce things, and I'll introduce the terrific speakers we've got in a minute, but just to say it's obviously been the 2020, which seems like a lifetime away now, but it's been a heck of a year. We've had COVID, of course. We've had the whole Black Lives Matter racial justice issue. We've had, particularly in the States, but we've all felt it, a really interesting and sometimes frightening populism sweeping through public life. We've got the climate crisis getting nearer and nearer to us as we go. So lots of things for lots of people to think about, and particularly, of course, philanthropists and foundations. Now, for those of you new to NPC, we are the think tank and consultancy for the social sector in the UK and beyond. We rely on funding to influence change, foster innovation and drive forward improvement. And we're grateful to our current donors and funders for their support. And we watch philanthropy a lot. We try and influence philanthropy to be more impactful in different ways. That's our kind of mission, to help the social sector become more impactful. So the immense things going on in the last year have brought to the fore many of the things that we've always cared about in philanthropy: agility, trust, core funding, attitudes to risk, and so on. And some of those were picked up in a publication we did a couple of years ago called Innovations in Philanthropy. And I think it's fair to say that with the coming of COVID and all the other things, that US foundations and philanthropists were probably quickest off the mark. We had a blog way back in March 2020 by our US Associate Director, David Pritchard, discussing some of that. And we've kept an eye ever since. And a lot of people in the UK certainly have kept an eye on what's been going on there and have tried to follow, whether they were following deliberately or just came to the same conclusions. It's something we'll probably end up debating. Of course, there are very big differences across countries, and just to take the UK and the US, we all know that philanthropy takes place in a very different context. It tends to be much bigger. In the US, goes to different causes. There's different issues about what the welfare state does and what the state does. There are also different, almost cultural issues about how involved philanthropists get involved in certain policy issues and how they advocate and so forth. Having said all that, you know, we are big crazy not to talk to each other, to try and learn, to try and understand what's going on, and try and filter the best bits from both sides. And that's something that we've always tried to do at NPC over the years. And we've always been very involved with a lot of youth foundations, involvement with Hewlett and Gates in the past, and currently working with MacArthur. And a last thing to say as introduction is we're thinking quite a lot at the minute about how philanthropy is changing and should change in a project called Open Philanthropy, which comes under some work we're doing, which is called Rethink Rebuild, where we're trying to say a lot of good things, a lot of bad things happened over the last year, but a lot of things happened in philanthropy which were good, and how can we cling hold of them and not let us revert back to the way we were in the past. And Open Philanthropy is trying to do that and also push on. So lots of reasons why we at NPC have organised the event today. And what we're going to do, the way things are going to work, is we're going to hear from two speakers. I'll then sort of ask them a few questions as a bit of a follow-up, and then we'll open it up to people. Either we'll be picking up questions that you put in the chat, or if by using the all the kind of reaction functions, all the rest of it, you can put your virtual hand up, and I will endeavour to bring you in. So I hope that that's clear, and we will end prompt UK time 6:30. So the first person speaking and going to present to us, really pleased to have Katherine Lorenz with us. She has done many things, but she's currently chair of the board of the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation. Very relevant for some of our work. She's also vice chair of the Philanthropy Workshop, and I'm sure Katherine can say more about other things, amazing amount of things that she does and has done. Over to you, Katherine.
Well, thank you very much. I'm extremely pleased to be here with you today. And as Dan said, I'm Katherine Lorenz. I am chair of my family's foundation, the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation, on the board of several philanthropy serving organizations, and currently a senior advisor to the National Center for Family Philanthropy. So the data I bring today is very much based on some of the research that has been done by the National Center for Family Philanthropy focused on US philanthropy in these times. And I'll note that before the pandemic hit, I spent about half my time living in London for nearly a decade. Have a crazy story about leaving with nothing but a carry-on with 15 minutes notice when Trump put the travel ban on. So I miss the UK. I've spent a lot of time thinking about and reflecting on the similarities and differences in US and UK philanthropy. So I'm delighted to be here today, and only wish that I could be here be there in person. So next slide, please. These are truly unprecedented times for the world, and of course for philanthropists. Today, I'm going to highlight 10 specific trends that emerged over the course of the last year in American philanthropy. And while certainly not every foundation has adopted any or all of these trends, the changes are notable and mark a significant shift in philanthropy's norms and expectations for donors. And like I said, this is data from the National Center for Family Philanthropy, which focuses primarily on American family foundations. So there's definitely a family lens to this data, but I think much of it applies to the whole sector. Next slide, please. The first trend to highlight is rethinking risk. Donors want a certain assurance that their grants are going to lead to impact. And of course, anyone would want their effort to be effective. But at this point, it is becoming abundantly clear that safe approaches are not working, and donors must become more comfortable with risk, particularly during these times of such difficulty. Donors are reorienting their relationship between community needs, risk, and values in light of the recent crises. 2020 highlighted more than ever that philanthropy is really the nation's risk capital, and that donors need to be more willing to take thoughtful risks in order to have meaningful impact on systemic issues. Next slide. Trust-based philanthropy. Philanthropy is normalizing a trust-based approach that accelerates learning and partnership and minimizes power dynamics and burdens on grantees. Donors are asking grantees what is needed and providing the support to accomplish their stated goals and objectives. Families across the US are leveraging many tools, including multi-year grants, fewer reporting requirements, general operating support, and more money is getting out the door quickly in order to respond to immediate needs using a trust-based approach. The next slide. Listening. There's a growing understanding that effective philanthropy must leverage the power and voices of the community and the end beneficiaries. Donors are recognizing that they do not have all the answers, and the communities in need are the ones with the most expertise, and donors are listening more authentically and openly to what they have to say. This listening is taking many forms, from independent board members joining family foundation boards, deeper relationships with grantees, participatory grant making, and diversity, equity, and inclusion practices at all levels of the organization. Next slide. A racial equity lens. Families are recognizing that racial equity and social justice are not only issue areas to fund, they're lenses through which they should do all of their work. Criticisms are growing on the colonizing effects of wealth and how we can mitigate them through different practices. There's ongoing personal and institutional reflection on privilege, white supremacy, and racial injustice on a level previously unseen by the field. For many giving families, this year marks the first moment of genuine reckoning with their own privilege, biases, and ineffective and sometimes even harmful approaches to philanthropy. Personally, I think this is the most profound shift in the US philanthropic sector this year. It's truly hard to overstate how quickly and broadly this change is happening. Next slide. Funding, recovery, and resilience. The effects of the pandemic are both immediate and long-term, and the philanthropic response must support short-term recovery and lasting nonprofit resilience. Many donors are asking how they can best support these efforts, and in many cases, the answer is to ensure the health of existing grantee partners. The pandemic has also exposed the weakness of our systems and the barriers they create to enduring change, and many donors are wondering how to move upstream in their giving. Next slide. Considering perpetuity. With opportunities ever present, many families are reevaluating their giving timelines. However, family philanthropy has a dual goal: the internal mission of family unity and the external mission of social impact. Many philanthropic families are struggling to reconcile the urgency of the moment with a desire to build a family legacy. So it's been important to reflect on this tension, and many foundations are considering their spending and investment policies with a mission-oriented lens in light of these crises. Next slide. Collaboration. There's a renewed interest in partnership and cross-sector collaboration. Donors are partnering with peer funders and leveraging intermediaries to scale impact, respond quickly, and build a strategy with joint expertise. Much of the collaboration has been driven by a desire to move quickly, often into new funding areas, in a time when doing due diligence has been extremely difficult. Next slide. Family engagement and values. During a particularly challenging year, we've seen so many families trying to go back to the basics and reconsider their motivations for giving and explore how their philanthropy carries forward their values. For many, this year was a year to realign their focus and approach to meet the vision of their philanthropy. With clearly defined values, a family has a North Star, a set of guidelines to weigh opportunities and measure success. And a clearly defined values-based decision-making framework is an essential tool for philanthropic families to ensure that their grant-making and governance are in pursuit of goals that advance their mission. Next slide. Transparency. Criticism continues to grow around the lack of donor transparency, and many donors are shifting practices to encourage better communication, information sharing, and intentionality around their giving. And next slide. The final point in this paper is around advancing the concept of stewardship. The very concept of stewardship is being challenged, and donors are being asked to reflect on how they are managing funds that are earmarked for the public good. They're being asked to be more transparent, more intentional, more effective, and more informed. And as we look to the future, donors have different responsibilities than ever before. They must be transparent, trust their grantees, listen to end beneficiaries, consider equity, take larger risks, and collaborate for greater impact. So in closing, these 10 trends are notable, but they're of course far from inclusive. I'm sure you've seen some similarities in the UK and some differences. So I'll hand it back to Dan to hear about the trends in the UK, and I will also paste in the chat a link to the paper that these 10 trends come from, where there's a bit more detail on each of them, and also paste in the chat a broader set of resources on trends in philanthropy throughout the UK. So thank you, and I'll pass it back to you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Catherine. So that was great, an awful lot there. And I think we'll come back to a lot of it as we go on. And as I say, do put questions in the chat as they occur to you, and we'll try and make sure we pick the kind of the questions that people are asking up a bit later on. But next, I'm delighted we've got Neil Heslop with us. Neil, I'm sure will introduce himself a bit as well, but I will too. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Charities Aid Foundation, which has American presence as well, actually. So that makes it very interesting. He's a former CEO of Leonard Cheshire, which is a major disability charity in the UK, after a long career in business in the telecoms industry. Neil, I'm sure you're going to reflect a little bit on what Catherine said, but let's hear how you think it's gone in the UK.
Well, thanks, Dan, and that was really interesting, and many echoes that from some of the trends I think very much resonate for some of the things that we've seen at the Charities Aid Foundation. What I thought I would do in the next 10 or 15 minutes is really just touch on 5 things. Tell you a little bit about the Charities Aid Foundation, just reflect on the lens that we look through as we think about the remarkable year that Dan talked about in terms of 2020. And also, Dan, you asked us also to share a perspective on what we thought was the role of philanthropy against that backdrop, and I'll do that. Talk a bit, fourthly, around what we've actually seen over the course of the last 12 to 15 months, and then maybe just conclude with a few observations that seem important to us. So as Dan said, Charities Aid Foundation, I joined CAF on the 1st of October last year, so right in the middle of this extraordinary year. For those not familiar with us, as an organization, we're a charitable foundation that acts really to get more money into the charitable sector, and then to support both the recipients and the donors of that money to really make it count. Pre-COVID, in 1920, what that meant for us was about 714 million pounds. And as Dan said, that's across both the UK and the US, and broadly about 2/3 of our activity is UK centric, but a significant and growing part of our activity is the work of Charities Aid Foundation of America. What we aspire to do really is to work cross-sector and cross-border, really to support the inspiration of innovation so that civil society may thrive. From a donor point of view, we look to partner both with corporates and private donors, really to realize greater impact from their giving. And we also seek to enable charities to deliver more life-changing work and all of the long-lasting benefits for all that flows from that. And it's probably worth saying that within the group, in addition to the charitable activity that I've just spoken about, we also have a for-profit trading subsidiary, which is a specialist bank providing banking services to about 15,000 UK based charities. I think the lens that we look through in terms of making sense of 2020 has really been informed and inspired by some of the work that Mark Carney has done, former governor of the Bank of England and now climate advisor both to the UN and to the UK government. And what Mark has done is really to position this period that we're right in the middle of, 2010 to 2030. And he posits that in generations to come, we in 20, 30, 40, 50 years time, we'll look back on this period and really recognize that the world has fundamentally changed. And of course, we're in thinking about 2020, we're smack in the middle of that period. And he would characterize that change as being a shift from the market economy to the market society. And he very much talks about that period between 2010 and 2020 being one of a predominance of financial value, and thinking about this period that we're in now in responding to the pandemic really as a resurgence in human values. And he then posits that clash and that realignment of those two things really signals in the years to come a period whereby values are going to become much more valuable endemically across society. And he views all of that through the lens of these three interlinked crises of the credit crisis, the COVID crisis, and of course the climate crisis. And I guess as we reflect on 2020 and think about the implications of what we've all seen for companies and communities and ultimately countries, I think we see some pretty fundamental and structural changes going on that have the potential to really change the way we think about what's going on in society and philanthropy's part within that. And I guess I really wanted just to respond to and how do we think about philanthropy against that backdrop, and what is its role? And from a CAF point of view, I think we see philanthropy's role very much to accelerate society's progress towards a fair and sustainable future for all. And that has very much informed some of our thinking about some of the fundamental changes that we've seen in 2020. And I think before moving on to what it is that we have seen, I just want to issue a couple of really explicit sort of health warnings to what I'm just about to say. Firstly, with respect to the longevity of some of the structural changes that I think we are increasingly confident are taking place around us, but frankly, it's too early to be truly confident. And then the specific about what we've actually experienced from an individual organization point of view, recognizing that the wider context, there's been a dramatic hole in the finances of those that we exist to serve, being the end charities. And here in the UK, it's been widely described as a £10 billion hole, and we very much see it in that context, and that investment ain't coming back. And as we think about the implications in the future, we're profoundly conscious that what we've seen at CAF is actually probably almost certainly completely out of step with what is being seen within the sector, because actually 2020 was a year where we saw a very, very significant uptake in the flows of funds from our philanthropy and corporate partners. And actually in calendar 2020, we were pretty much 40% up year over year. And that really speaks to how many existing and new participants in the field have really stepped up and responded to COVID. And we see all of that work very much through the lens of the themes of survive, adapt, and thrive, which really speak to a number of the things that we heard a little bit earlier from Katherine. And I suppose what they really are proxies for was this desire to significantly increase agility and flexibility and the focus on sustainability, so that there was a real drive and urgency to shorten timeframes, to get cash out to the front line where it can make a difference in real short order. Also, the recognition that grant makers and philanthropists needed to be dramatically more flexible about how they were thinking about what they were asking from charity partners, and supporting a much greater emphasis on core funding, on less requirements around programmatic funding, really with a view to supporting organizations to pivot their activity and actually recover, or at least begin the process of recovering and establishing longer term sustainability. I think we saw all of those three trends very much through the lens of the healthcare and social care crisis, and in terms of what we were seeing in how communities were responding. But through that sort of that healthcare and that social care lens, and I think it's probably worth saying for colleagues in the other side of the pond, social care is a long-standing area of public policy controversy here in the UK, and there is a widespread recognition built over the last 10 or 20 years that our social care provision is a very, very significant policy area for us that's caught up the whole of the political establishment very much in what is the right financial settlement within the context of our National Health Service. So that those healthcare and social care agendas really shone a massive light on underpinning social issues around poverty, very much around racial disparity, some real echoes from some of the consequences of Black Lives Matters, but very much through the lens of some healthcare disparities as expressed by disproportionate effects of COVID on those communities that were particularly marginalized, either through race, through poverty, and actually through disability. And I think what we've seen as a backdrop to a lot of our work is a real desire to direct activity to those themes through the course of 2020. I think the other observation I would make is that we, along with many organizations, have often felt that the partnership between private and public and third sector offered the potential for some real step forwards. And I think quite often the rhetoric that we've seen hasn't always matched up to the reality in recent years. And however, I think in 2020, we certainly experienced a couple of examples where those kind of partnerships genuinely emerged and have made a very important contribution. And I guess the one case study or tangible example I would point to is a thing called the COVID-19 Support Fund, which was a three-way collaboration with CAF and the Association of British Insurers and Long-Term Investment Industry, where financial organizations, best part of 40 of them, really came together in partnership with CAF and also with DCMS as part of the Community Match Fund to pull together, 104 million pounds as a tripartite effort to support those themes of survive, adapt, and thrive. There was a big emphasis on getting cash out through the National Emergencies Trust to some 10,000 charities in those early days, and working with the business in the community, so that sense of collaboration and partnership we spoke about was very much in evidence there. There was then a more of a thrust around pivoting of of organizations' ability to respond and deliver services. So, there was a grant of about £41 million, about 14 of the larger organizations across the UK charity space. But also there was a real emphasis seeking to reach out to those very, very small community organizations, some 650 of them, getting cash out to them in smaller grants. And I think as we move on to the final part of that case study, very much our emphasis is on how do we leave that extraordinary intervention with a real lasting legacy that is contributing to supporting particularly small and community-based organizations in the long run as they seek to both survive and re-establish a sustainable business model. So those are some of the kinds of things, and I guess that raises all the kind of questions about where that growth's come from. Has it come from new supporters or existing? It's largely come pretty much half and half, actually. Our existing philanthropists and corporate partners really stepped up and did more, but we also saw new people seeking to work with us in that overall effort. And I guess I'll probably just conclude with a few observations that we've certainly been reflecting on. I guess the first is what I think of as this dual paradox, in that for so much of the third sector and the charitable ecosystem last year was this paradox of absolutely spiraling demand at a time of collapsing income. And I think the way that the sector really stepped forward with that as a backdrop has been really quite extraordinary. But I think the paradox that then leads on to, if you accept the Carney thesis about the resurgence in human values and this rebalancing of priorities and this sentiment of values becoming valuable prospectively, I think we have the paradox that society is coming to that realization right at the time here in the UK, where a very large proportion of the smaller and community-based organizations are really facing an existential threat about their very existence and their ability to contribute. And I think for policymakers right across society, that raises some pretty profound questions. And while for us in the UK, you've got people like Gus O'Donnell talking about the criticality of being able to measure the social sector much more effectively, and you've got commentators like Andy Haldane at the Bank of England talking very, very powerfully about the need to address financial fragility and infrastructure deficits and the seat at the table, and the government commissioning the Danny Kruger work. There is absolutely a consensus that we're at a pivot point and an appetite for change. I think the issue for us as we think about the future is how does all of that really properly marry up with the government's priorities as expressed through the National Infrastructure Plan about how do we as a country recover from COVID. How do we engage in the whole leveling up agenda, which is so fundamentally about getting at long-term systemic barriers of social injustice, and then how do we see all of that against an overwhelming backdrop of net zero? So there you go. That's been our experience and some thoughts, hopefully, to contribute to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Neil, and really interesting, as well as how you got into all these issues so quickly, only taking over back in October. So first bit, I'm just going to kind of come back to Neil and Katherine a little bit, and I'm slightly picking up some of the things being said in the the chat and so forth. I mean, the first thing, I mean, a lot of the things that you've both observed, I mean, we've certainly seen among philanthropists, and to be honest, I've been quite impressed with how philanthropy has moved and quite quickly. And let's face it, on the whole, this is a sector that doesn't move that quickly. It took a crisis. We wish we hadn't had the crisis, but nevertheless, it took it. But the question I just want to put to you, maybe Katherine, you come in on it first, is, I mean, is this going to stick? I mean, or, you know, was it just a kind of response to various crises which people sort of reacted to? There was a visible COVID crisis. There was obviously all the racial justice issues and so on. And suddenly philanthropists who for years wouldn't fund core, took ages to ever decide, wouldn't collaborate with other people, suddenly did it. But are they going to stick, or is it going to go away? What do you think, Katherine?
Well, that's the big question. I'm not sure any of us can really know. I mean, I would certainly say in the US, it feels like certain aspects of this will definitely stick. How strong and how permanent it will be is a question, but I think much of it has shaped for sure the future. I think in particular, as I noted, some of the racial justice, racial equity issues in the US, it has now permeated the whole world, philanthropy and beyond, in a way that just frankly was not necessarily the case before, in particular, George Floyd's murder last summer. And that has, I would say, a lot of the trends I highlighted are actually quite related. The proximity to beneficiaries, understanding that racial equity is not just something you fund, but it's a lens through which you do everything, bringing on, rethinking your role as stewards. They're all kind of related, really rethinking, what is privilege and how do I have so much money and why am I in a position to give away money in the first place? A lot of these are so interrelated. I'm not sure they'll stick forever, but pieces of them will certainly stick. And I think some of the questions are around the role of monitoring evaluation and will that all this push for data. And as I noted in the chat, it's a bit of a pendulum, I think. And I imagine some of these issues will be like that, where it might be on one end of the pendulum, but I'm not sure we'll ever go back in full swing to the other side. We might come back to the middle a little bit, but I do think many of the changes, for the most part, will stick to some degree.
And just
how's that for a non-answer?
No, and just to follow up with one other thing, Katherine, which came through my head as you were speaking earlier, which is, I mean, is this prevalent across a lot of family foundations in the States, or is it a kind of small group? I mean, I'm always aware that whenever we go and speak in the US or whatever, and we sometimes express our admiration for the way some of the philanthropy goes on in the States and a bit more strategic and all the rest of it. And then people often say to us, we've got a long tail of family foundations aren't like that at all. They don't change. They don't really know what they're doing. It's all a bit random. And so I wonder whether these changes you went through, are they sort of, to different degrees, sort of working their way through the whole sector, or is it just a kind of small group, or what?
I would say it's larger than I would have anticipated and broader than I have seen change like this happen in the past. I recognize I work for an organization where only those who are serious about their philanthropy and seeking support come. But I mean, I'll even say in our own family foundation, we started having deep conversations about racial equity and the extent to which we want to integrate it throughout in a way that has never happened before. And we focus on the environment. And it actually, in an interesting way, that was driven by our staff. Our staff started asking the questions and starting to push us to move our portfolios in ways that we had not considered. And it forced us to have some of the conversations, not to say we didn't want to, but it was coming kind of from all angles. And that really had not been the case on almost any issue previous to this. And so I do think it is a lot broader. I'm seeing, businesses thinking about it in ways that had never happened before. So I do think it actually is quite broad. There are always many, many family foundations who are very small and informal and might not be looking at what the sector trends are. But I think in this case, certainly the racial equity conversation is much broader than I would have anticipated. I do, some of these questions around trust-based philanthropy and a lack of reporting requirements and things like that, I don't think that will stick for very long. I do think some of that is really, I mean, for us, again, using our family foundation as an example, we are very metrics driven and goals oriented. And we essentially, our goal through the summer was, how do we make sure that our best grantees survive the crisis? I don't think anyone could have anticipated that the stock market would be at an all-time high within a couple of months. And so all of our grantees were worried that they couldn't even exist. And so our number one goal was, how can they pay rent? How can they keep their key employees employed? And how do they just stay alive so that they're around to continue on this fight that we need to fight for environmental issues primarily. But that, we weren't asking metrics. I mean, we wanted you to be able to pay the rent, but now we're back, like they're all doing just fine. Fundraising has been just fine. So I think we're gonna be back in a kind of different spot. So I anticipate those were very in the moment. People need to eat, people need to pay rent. As it's evolved, I think some of those things that will obviously change.
Thanks, Katherine. And Neil, I mean, you talk, for instance, about kind of multi-sector collaborations and so forth, which had come together during COVID. I mean, will they stick? Is that the future? Is CAF going to put its weight behind making sure they happen?
Yeah, I think the whole process of that experience has caused us to be very reflective about what it is that we need to do from an internal cohesion point of view, but also from an external collaboration point of view. And I think, we're absolutely clear that the nature of some of these intractable problems is going to demand of the sector and therefore demand of us doing things differently. So I think I am hopeful, without being confident yet, that more will stick than I think perhaps people will have assumed beforehand. I think there are reasons to believe that. And I think a lot of those are about the fundamental drivers around economic shock, actually. So I think the whole net zero environments, the whole reorientation around ESG, the apparent change to the possibility, and I'm not a rose-tinted idealist in this respect, but I think there are some fundamental shifts going on around climate change, around major financial institutions, around economic regeneration, and a number of those things are being accelerated and driven by digitization. The life cycle of true data, of that life cycle where people understand A intervention is delivered in B time frame, and you see the outcome very, very quickly. I think the art of the possible of that, I think, is understood in more places than I've seen in the recent past, and therefore I do believe that the march of technology, the change to people's working lives, the way they are thinking differently about engaging in their local community and change to patterns, I think there's some quite profound things going on in society, and I think many of them will stick. I am hopeful that then creates the opportunity for organizations such as ours and everybody interested in progressive social change to see an acceleration in the progress than that which we might otherwise have expected.
No, thanks, Neil. I mean, it's interesting, even, obviously digital, I'm sure it happened in the States too. The fact we were all locked down meant that a lot of charities, non-profits, I realize the language is a bit different across the two countries, but were forced very quickly to start to trying to deliver services to vulnerable people using digital technology, which had challenges. It also had challenges for funders who we pointed out in the past, charitable funders, certainly in Britain, have been rather poor at funding digital, digital programs, partly because people don't like funding kit. And secondly, often a digital program, you don't quite know what's going to happen. And grant offices on the whole have always quite liked to say, these people, they applied to us for a grant for 3 years. They said they're going to achieve this. When they come forward and say, we want to try some digital stuff, we don't really know if it'll work, but we think that's the future. Will you fund us? It's been more difficult. So I kind of hope that what we've experienced during COVID has taught us all a lot, and that both, charities that have learned where delivering online services works, where it doesn't really work very well. Funders have understood a bit better about how to fund this kind of stuff, and so forth. I just wanted to ask another question, and then I'll bring in other people. But there's an interesting relationship, and it may well be different across the countries, about the relationship with government. Because I think we certainly saw in the UK, a lot of the charitable foundations and philanthropists were trying to work out where the need was. And we were very pleased to see that they certainly did seem keener to use data, which we were kind of churning out as much as we could about where the need was. But the other question was, but what is government already funding? In a sense, we want to fill in the gaps where they're not going to fund. And it was quite difficult to work out what government was going to do. They were very slow in saying what they were going to do, then trying to work out where they'd funded. And government in the UK as well was a little bit, I thought, rather slow off the mark to talk to the philanthropy and foundation sector and say, well, what are you going to do? And can we match fund and so forth? Did anything like that happen in the US, Katherine, or is it just such a different culture? It just wasn't an issue?
Well, I'd say we had a unique challenge in data and science with our previous president. And so I think we had a unique challenge in trying to figure out what was going on broadly during those times. I mean, I think it's hard to kind of overstate the multiple crises. For us, it was COVID, then the racial riots and George Floyd's murder, and then the elections kind of all going on within the same couple of months. And so, in terms of like depending on government, I think at a local level, there are some great cross-sector collaborations and people working together. I think at a large national scale, that, from what I understand, there was very little coordination or philanthropy coordinating with government from what I know. But to be fair, I actually don't know. I think so much of the philanthropy that I was hearing about in the summer and early fall was around the riots, and then and funding racial equity, and then in particular get out the vote, and how to influence everybody's ability to actually even be able to have a voice in an election during COVID. And so yeah, I actually don't know. I think every specific local level I've heard of, also, where I live, people working with the local government to get COVID tests in schools and all that kind of stuff. That was certainly happening. Local food banks. I think there was a lot of coordination there with philanthropy and local immediate response. But that would have been community by community, not at large scale.
No, thanks, Katherine. I mean, Neil, any reflections on that from what you saw? Obviously, there was a lot happening at local level, but what about at the national level?
I think it went through a life cycle. And so, I mean, obviously for us, the big both important milestone and disappointment was the £750 million at the Chancellor's settlement. And I think the sector came together to advocate for support. £750 million is a lot of money. I mean, it's a bunch of money. When you put it in the context of a £2 trillion economy, it doesn't feel quite so much. And I think your point about coming a little bit late to the potential of philanthropy, my perception, and I think it's worth saying that my experience of this COVID period was a bit of a game of two halves, because, as you said at the outset, for the first 6 months I was in led a Cheshire, an international disability charity with a large social care outfit. So that first phase of the crisis in sort of March through June, felt like I think many other aspects of the crisis, actually, I think the practical reality was the government was reeling. It was reeling from a global pandemic of unprecedented impact. I think all of us would probably believe that we went into that pandemic less prepared than perhaps we as a society should have done. So I think there's an awful lot of understandable reasons, but I think as that £750 million got committed, and it was really the last 110 million of it which the DCMS sought to really use for the multiplier effect and actually get involvement from philanthropists. And from our experience of working with them was that was very effective, and that was a component part of the case study that I referred to. So 20 million of that 104 million was from that DCMS part of the equation. I think the critics would say, and I think with some justification, that was really 3, 6, 9 months into the crisis, and I think there was, I think that's a legitimate challenge to government in terms of its speed of response. I have to say, from our perspective of having been part of the group working with them, there was a huge push and recognition from DCMS about the criticality of getting that cash to the front line to make a difference very quickly once it got mobilized. And I believe that a decent job was done, but I think there's all sorts of lessons that we all need to learn from as we've gone through this extraordinary experience. And Katherine spoke about that sequence of COVID and George Floyd's murder, then followed by the presidential election. I think we had a different sequence given the whole timing of our election settling down in December 19, the ultimate national identity crisis around Brexit and all of that trauma for the last 4 or 5 years, all of that playing at the time. So I think history, there's a huge opportunity for all of these parties to really reflect and learn, so that next time round, and I suspect there will be a next time round, we're in a far better shape than it felt like we were in the last 12 months.
No, thanks, Neil. I mean, I think it's interesting that there's some feeling. I mean, there were all sorts of things we weren't ready to go on a pandemic, but one of the things, it took a while for government to get its relationships with, for instance, philanthropy going. And it's interesting that the Beacon Collaborative, which some people here will know and which we're part of, and so is CAF, actually kind of represents philanthropists in some ways. One of the policy asks it's making at the minute is to, I think, have something they're calling a philanthropy commissioner in government, so that the relations are better, so that when it's suddenly needed that we've all got to talk to each other and coordinate a bit better. It's not like we didn't know each other in advance, and it's tricky getting these things right, because that philanthropy it is by definition independent of government, and it doesn't want to. That's one of its joys and its strengths and all the rest of it. But some more coordination. Okay, I'm going to take some questions, and feel free to stick your virtual hand up, even if you put a question in the chat. And if I can't see you, shout out, because I've got separate screens. But I'm going to go to Hugh Davidson first, not least because he modestly put in a question, so he gets the prize. Hugh, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Got to unmute yourself, Hugh. You're on mute.
Done it.
No, you've gone back on again. You unmuted yourself and gone back on. That's it. Don't press anything else.
Okay.
Yep.
You can hear me, right? Yes, I just be interested in the speaker's views on a comparison with climate change, because Greta Thunberg, when she was on a week or so ago, said it's amazing on COVID A thing that takes us 10 years, getting a new vaccine, it's taken us 1 year, and there's a real sense of urgency. And the reason for that is that COVID is happening here, it's happening now, and it's happening to everybody. And the question is, can we get the same sort of urgency into climate change that we've successfully achieved on COVID?
No, thanks for that, Hugh. And a good question. I mean, are any of those trends that you identified, Katherine, are they going to help us do better on climate change than we've done in the past?
Well, to me, what it has shown is that if you actually want to make a difference and throw money into the system, you can. I mean, the amount of money that our government has put into combating the COVID crisis, if they did the same thing for climate change, we'd be on a very different path. So I think that's good news. The question is whether or not those priorities will actually come to the forefront enough for a government to do that. Certainly in the US, that's the big question. I mean, in these trends that I spoke about, that's really around kind of governance and how people are the how people are doing philanthropy, not necessarily the what. I would say another big trend, certainly from before COVID, actually, is a huge move, I think, and I'm seeing toward funders wanting to fund climate change. Not a lot of infrastructure to do so, a lot of really massive funders that are looking for kind of partners to deploy the capital or kind of big, huge bets, I mean, whether it's the Bezos Earth Fund making hundreds of millions of dollars and a few grants of $100 million to certain organizations and whatnot. Those sorts of commitments are definitely happening in philanthropy. So I think the question will be, will it be enough to kind of then sway the US government to make the kind of commitments that it will need to make for at least the US to be able to reach some of the climate goals? I mean, we have an administration right now who's clearly extremely committed to this as well. So we are in a different spot than we were a year ago, but so much is needed. I guess my big takeaway is, if people want this and are willing to vote for leaders who want it, we can make it happen. But unclear that's the way it's going to go.
Neil, what do you think? I mean, you talked about Mark Carney, and that's obviously been a big part of Mark. I'm not quite sure how much he's talked about philanthropy and its role, but
he's talked less about philanthropy, but I mean, he's talked a lot about ESG, and the G, of course, has been about governance and fundamentally about using financial market instruments bluntly to redirect very, very large flows of money. And he certainly perceives that there is dramatic change going on amongst the financial community, really, for organizations to pivot. And he's talking about flows of like $70 trillion. And so. And I think what we're seeing in some of the financial partners that we have is there is a seriousness and a mainstream of net zero and where the money is going in a way that has not been the case before. Now, whether it is sufficient to accelerate to Hugh's point about the scale and urgency, I think time's going to tell. But I do think that there is a growing alignment of the stars that make it quite, if not probable, then certainly possible in a way that I wouldn't have thought it was 12 months ago. And I think it's significant around the change of the Biden administration, and everyone thought about that as being a transitory administration before it happened. I think the early days it's looking quite a lot more ambitious and potentially transformative. Now, clearly, it's coming from a long way back after recent years. But that, when you think about COP, the conference in November and the G7. I do think that there is a gathering momentum here that has the potential for the kind of cut through. And frankly, I also think the COVID things, I think people have started to believe the art of the possible as a result of the last 12 months in a way that they probably wouldn't have done 12 months ago. Now, let's see, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
Thanks, Neil. I mean, it's good to hear we're in optimistic mood tonight. Which, I mean, you know, in a sense, if we're not optimistic, what's the point? But I suppose we all have to think about, you know, what do we all have to do to keep that kind of optimistic momentum and not the other side. I'm going to take a question, if she wants to give it herself, from Betsy Dillner. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question that I think you put in the chat, but it'd be good if you wanted to ask it yourself.
Yes, sorry, I just swallowed tea.
Sorry.
Excuse me. Yeah, I think it was just this might be less relevant to the US. I am an American in the UK, so but I think that when we saw, especially in the UK, there was, you know, the rise of the mutual aid movement, Fridays for the Future, you know, this sort of decentralized, sort of unconstituted groups that are really reacting on the ground to what's happening and can really make a very, very large amount of difference for quite small amounts of money. And how philanthropy, because we've been doing some fiscal aid hosting with the mutual aid movement, and some philanthropists are saying, yes, please take it. We understand there are new ways of creating accountability other than going through the Charity Commission. And I think that I would say the vast majority of philanthropists are not quite moving there, but that is increasingly how communities are responding to crisis. So how do we bridge that gap?
Thank you, Betsy. And just to add, it's not quite the same point, but I thought I'd throw it in as well, coming back to Neil and Katherine. I mean, there's obviously been a lot of movements over the last year. Extinction Rebellion, certainly in the UK, have made a big noise. We've had the Black Lives Matter movement, and a lot of philanthropists have wondered, you know, should they fund these organizations, which often don't have a kind of, you know, a governance structure that you can kind of inspect and hold to account and all the rest of it. I mean, how's that played out, both the community point that Betsy was raising and that sort of movement thing? Katherine, how's that played out in the States?
Yeah, I think there's a huge move to fund movements and people and communities. That's one of the trends about being more proximate to the communities you serve, both listening and then funding community movements, community leaders that may not have the normal infrastructure, they may not have the metrics, they may not have the strategic plans, but they are kind of, you know, on the ground leading change. And I've seen a huge shift. I think a piece of that was also about funding democracy, kind of, you know, the whole year previous to the elections, people thinking about how to fund change. Stacey Abrams and the work in Georgia, I think it's all kind of related of getting money into the hands and resources into the hands of people who are leading change in communities that are most in need of change.
And I mean, in a sense, as you say, that almost symbolizes the change, because, you know, exactly, you don't look at governance because there isn't governance. You don't necessarily look for a well thought out strategy because to some extent you won't find it. So I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, at NPC, we've, you know, been rethinking a bit how we advise philanthropists. Well, quite a lot actually, because, you know, a worry that our rather sensible advice, particularly to kind of new philanthropists, is look for organizations that do have good governance, have got a strategy, in some way can answer the question, how do you know you're doing any good? But that does guide you away from movements. It sometimes guides you away from small, newly formed, often Black-led community organizations and so forth. And so what is the answer there? And it slightly comes back to something you emphasized, Katherine, in kicking off, which was risk. Mm-hmm. And appetites for risk. And I guess philanthropists will differ in that.
I mean, I'm seeing it even in the large nonprofits we fund in the environment. Almost all the very large, well-established environmental nonprofits are now incorporating environmental justice in a way they never have before. That's often kind of locally led movements fighting, you know, environmental fights, but in a kind of local movement building way. So I'm seeing it across the board, from funders to large NGOs who've normally not played in that space, and just kind of across the board. It is definitely a big shift. Again, a question as to whether or not it will stick, but I anticipate that at least a large component will. And I heard some really compelling donors talking about how they were responding to the crisis immediately when COVID hit, and things like unconditional cash transfers, direct housing assistance, direct food aid, all kind of just putting the resources into the communities with kind of no strings attached. And I think it is all related, and will continue to a certain extent to continue to stay that way. Although, again, like the pendulum will swing back a little bit after the immediate crisis is gone.
No, thanks, Catherine. And Neil, I mean, have you seen that people who sort of put their money through CAF, are they looking to fund more community organisations and movements, or?
We've seen a bit of that, not a massive degree. I mean, I guess I'd probably say 2 or 3 things in response to this part of the discussion. We did. I mean, the first thing to say, I think Betty's observation is absolutely on the money, and actually really chimes with some of the work that we've done with Andy Haldane, the chief economist at the Bank of England, who talked about that spectrum from the more formal legal entity, stronger governance side of the sector to the opposite end of that, that very loose community-based movement. And of course, the opposite, those 2 ends of that spectrum, they're brilliant for different things. And I think one of the things that we want from the system are mechanisms that come about that support and sustain both sides of it. So I'm less familiar with it, but I would have thought, the scope for some of the things that Catherine's been talking about in terms of family foundations around direct funding for community-centric movements, there's perhaps a greater degree of discretion and flexibility than for something of a pseudo sort of part of the institution around the more formal side of charity, such as us, where that legal entity and the governance as we move money through is a much bigger part of what we do. I think the racial disparity emphasis has caused us really to be searching out partners and organizations who we can support, who are in a better position in terms of that conduit. And one such, I'm sure they wouldn't mind us talking about it, but a Baobab Foundation, which is is a new organization that's been seeking to come into existence very much with a membership outreach to some many hundreds of community-based organizations led from within minority communities. So we're exploring how can we direct support and work with philanthropists and corporate supporters to support those kinds of initiatives, because we think that within there's the prospect of reaching out and better serving the more informal end of the community-centric ecosystem, as it were.
No, thanks, Neil. And we've obviously, certainly in the UK, seen quite a lot of the bigger charitable foundations, although they never look very big compared to the US ones, but trying to sometimes sort of grant a chunk of money to an intermediary who they feel is closer to community groups and letting them make the decisions about where the money goes. And that's been a really interesting trend, and how that works out, and whether more do it and how they judge whether it's success or not is going to be, I think, one of the agendas going forward. And I suspect the same thing's been happening in the US, has it, Catherine?
Yes, it definitely has. And I think this, the question as to whether or not will last, I think will also depend on people's experience or foundation's experience with it. So, what was the impact? Did it feel like it had the meaningful impact they were hoping for? It's a bit of a risk taking a chance, trying it in a new way. And depending on the outcomes, I think will also depend on which foundations continue in that practice and which don't.
Okay, I'm going to ask, I think Sylvia Brown's got a good question. So Sylvia, it's a great picture of you. And I hope you can hear me and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, we've heard a lot about big donors, foundations, public-private partnerships, but there's also a mass of small and mid-sized donors out there who have reacted, mostly funding frontline support. But I'd be curious to know what our speakers think about some fundamental changes at that level. These small and mid-sized donors tend not to do much research. They give to big name charities. They give to charities that they have a personal relationship with. Do you see any prospect of changing these habits, of making them more thoughtful and effective? Because I don't see how all these changes are going to happen if the 50% of philanthropic dollars or pounds that come from smaller donors are not, if there's not a major educational effort engaged with this group as well as the big donors.
What do you think about that, Katherine?
Well, I would first say, Sylvia, you are the expert on the size donor, so I might turn the question back on you, if I'm honest. I think from my limited experience with what I've seen, I think the kind of outpouring of immediate donations from small and mid-sized donors to local food banks, local homeless shelters, the kind of all the things that were immediate and reactive and necessary in the height of the crisis. That was huge. Whether or not in the future that will make them be more educated donors, I have no idea. I think that they were very much drawn by the immediate need they saw in front of them, and certainly, like bigger donors, doing less research, not more. So I don't quite see how that would lead to needing, or kind of a sense of wanting to do more and more deep dive into doing it better. But again, I might ask you what you think.
Sylvia, you're going to come back on that before Neil comes in?
No, well, I'd really like to hear what Neil has to say first, maybe about the UK.
Okay, fair enough. Neil.
I think, what do I think? There is and there's, qualify this, there's a real danger of taking this too empirically, because it's an observation on a focus group of two, and that's my 24-year-old and 22-year-old daughters and their peer group. And just by observation, what I have seen in them and their group, in terms of their response to some of the things that we've spoken about, direct community action, some of the things we've spoken about, social movements, the depth and seriousness with which that generation are very often thinking about how they make a difference personally and philanthropically and financially is really fascinating and actually really quite optimistic, I think, for the culture of philanthropic giving over time. I think the challenge is, like everything in their lives, it's immediate and it's digital. And so their expression of what they're giving and how they're giving and where they're giving, and it's very, very tied up with direct volunteering and that whole mix. I think there's a real generational shift going on in response to what they are perceiving bluntly is our failure. in society writ large, and their desire and willingness to seek to do direct things about it. I think, I think by observation, there are a number of charitable organizations that I see in the UK who are being incredibly clever in tapping into that vibe and really seeing a flow of resources really very, very quickly that are really quite challenging expectations of what could happen. And what that raises for us at CAF is quite a lot of thinking about how do you support, you know, the tens of thousands of organizations who are doing extraordinary things but do not currently have the capacity to invest and create that capability to tap into that vibe on a systemic basis. And I'm not sure that we have a great answer to that right now, but I do think it's another example of some of the real shifts that are starting to happen around us. And I think different people that I talk to about this, you know, there are different degrees of skepticism or belief in the potential that some of these things have. I think the great thing, I'm really struck by an observation that someone once made a number of years ago, that trends start, really serious, important trends start a long time before you notice them. And I just wonder whether there isn't something really quite long lasting and substantive gathering pace out there. And we're going to look at it really, really very closely, I think. So I'm not sure if that speaks to what you're thinking about, Sylvia, but that was what I was thinking about when you posed the question.
Yeah, no, I've actually just moved to Britain, and I'm going to be working with the Beacon Collaborative, developing a virtual course for new donors and small donors. And I was very interested to read their recent report on millennial giving, which encapsulates a lot of the trends you're talking about. So I think if we can capture this this demographic and educate it, I think the future could be very promising.
Well, thanks for that, Sylvia. And I mean, you know, at a sort of, I don't know, simpler level, you know, we've been observing, as lots of others have over the last few years, the coming of the sort of next gen philanthropists, and how sometimes within families, foundations, it's causing a bit of trouble because the newer members of the family who are getting involved want to go about their business, the things they fund, the issues about how their endowment is invested and so forth in a very different way from the older members of the family. So it's caused some tension, some good tension on the whole, and I'm sure that will play out too, as well as the kind of things that both Sylvia and Neil were talking about. I love the fact that in the discussion about philanthropy, we're now talking about the new vibe. I think that's pretty good news. I'm going to take a question which I think has been in the chat from our very own David Pritchard, our very own man in the US. David, do you want to ask your question there?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Well, it's very simple. You know, trying to predict the future obviously is sort of maybe a fool's mission, but have we, to the extent that there has been a positive response in sort of smoothing out the kind of the big bump in charity finances, non-profit finances, are we likely to be seeing signs of funding scaling back from both the public sector and the philanthropic sector? Is this what we should be expecting for the next few years? Mm. Or any signs of that even now?
What do you think, Katherine? Are we people starting to think it's all over and pulling back, and a lot of non-profits will go under, or what's going to happen?
I mean, again, good question, but I don't see that. I mean, I think in particular, our new administration continues to want to invest in many things related to, you know, that are related to this. And I see more and more donors I think this question about perpetuity and spending and digging deep is continuing. I do think many foundations are suddenly reconsidering perpetuity and whether or not they should actually be spending more right now. So maybe on the immediate needs around, you know, like food banks and housing needs and whatnot, that might start to kind of dry up a little bit, but I don't sense kind of a big pullback as long as our kind of economy continues to be as strong as it is. I mean, I think that will probably drive it more than the kind of changing needs, I would guess.
Thanks, Catherine. And Neil, I mean, we know certainly from data from previous recessions and so on in the UK that the smaller end of the sort of charity non-profit sector they tend not to go under, they don't go bust, they shrink and slowly disappear, and sometimes can disappear from sight. I mean, do you think that philanthropists and charitable foundations will keep funding them, or will they, you know, get a bit bored and move on to the next exciting vibe?
You need to get out a bit more, Dan, if vibe's a big issue for you, you know. I think there's sort of a macro and a micro answer to the question that was posed. So our view, you know, I mentioned that, you know, year over year we were seeing 40% up. In looking budgetary wise, you know, a big question for us is how much of that is going to stick. And our view is pretty positive. We do think it will soften a little bit next year, but we actually think 80% of that growth will stick. Now, you know, predicting the future, and if we have this conversation in 12 months' time, I might think, what were we smoking? But right now, that feels like, based on everything that we're seeing, a fairly sensible assumption to go into the new year. I think the macro observation I would make is that, you know, the pandemic and the economic shock, in the same way that it's exposed inherent disparities of social injustice, it's shone a bloody great light on them all. The actual experience economically has been extraordinarily diverse, you know, and that for a portion of society, the last 12 months has been the build-up of some very substantial additional savings, and at a UK economy level, that's probably in the neighbourhood of 140 billion quid. Now there's questions that, you know, clearly all of those savings are in the top third of earners and those parts of the economy that have done okay out of the pandemic. I don't know whether that's an appropriate thing to say, but, you know, they've actually ended up financially being significantly better off. So I think there's an open question as what happens to it all. And does even a relatively small proportion of that find its way into philanthropy and giving? You know, you're talking about pretty sizable amounts of money. I would hope that with the right encouragement, the right interventions, possibly the right fiscal intervention from the government, a significant proportion of that could be encouraged to flow into charity. Whether it will be, I just don't know.
Thanks, Neil. I'm going to take a very last question. It had to be a short, sharp answer from Katie Boswell from NPC. It's a good old chestnut of NPCs, but so can't resist it. Katie.
Sure, thanks, Dan. I was a bit greedy and put 2 questions in the chat, but I'm assuming you're referring to the one about perpetuity. And this is based on something Catherine said about the debate going on in the US. And here in the UK, as Dan mentioned, NPC has also often talked about payout ratios. And I was just really interested in hearing how that debate is going in the US and what do you think the lessons are for us here in the UK, Catherine?
Sure. Well, I mean, we have slightly different laws that require a 5% payout per year, as I'm sure you know. So many big foundations and small, but very publicly foundations like Ford and MacArthur and some others who have traditionally been in perpetuity dug very deeply and kind of interesting financing models in order to pay out more without jeopardizing their ability to exist in perpetuity. So I mean, that was one example showing that even if they kind of weren't able to start spending down, they were kind of digging deep right now. And then those who could dig deep now, both and still stay in perpetuity at a smaller level, or actually start the process of spending down. Many other funders did that. And then I'd say what I see driving the perpetuity conversation is some of the climate change is actually a huge component in it. So many funders who are funding in issues around climate change are saying, you know, dollar spent now is much more effective than a dollar spent later. So that is the reason. I mean, there are other reasons as well, but it is definitely, I mean, compared to 10 years ago, it is a major question at the forefront of many foundations. And I've seen a lot of families considering it too, actually including our own, in a way that was never part of the past. And what I hear families talk about often is working together is becoming more difficult. And that was especially in light of some of the political divide in the US. So many families were seeing divisions politically in a way that in the past had not actually created issues among the family, but now there's a specific type of political division that it was actually permeating the foundation's culture. And I've seen that in many families out of the blue talking about perpetuity because they're having a hard time working together based on values and different beliefs that were starting to kind of rear their heads in ways they never had in generations of working together. So I think there are a number of different things driving those conversations. You know, I talked about the you know, the multiple crises, but I'd failed to mention some of the very clear climate crises, the fires in California, the energy issues in Texas, the blackout. So there were some also coming to light of some of these climate issues too. And so I think a number of those things are driving these perpetuity conversations. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but many things adding to it, and a lot just more data on what it can look like, what different, you know, how that works. Many more foundations having done it, a lot more people wanting to kind of do the giving while living, not necessarily leave it to their children and grandchildren. So many things driving it.
Thank you, Katherine. Neil, have you got a one minute thought on that?
I don't think I've got anything useful to say over and above what's just been said, to be honest, Dan.
No, thanks, Neil. I mean, it's something that we continue to kind of have an interest in. It obviously a lot of UK foundations and philanthropists have changed their behaviours during this period. And it'll be interesting to see, particularly with the climate crisis. Katherine.
I had one more thing. I think this racial reckoning and the issues around privilege and actually a fundamental belief in some of the younger donors that actually holding and amassing wealth is actually a big part of the problem. I think that as younger donors are coming into leadership, they're really grappling with, you know, how did I inherit this wealth? Is it in conflict with our overall mission and values to actually hold wealth rather than deploy it right now into the communities? And so that's another really key driving force.
There's some very interesting conversations, the dynamics going on in the sector. I mean, it's all fascinating and some of it exciting and some of it quite difficult. So I'm going to stop now because we've run out of time. I'm not going to try and summarize the discussion, which has been terrific. Do keep in touch with us and with this work. We've got an event coming up. I don't know if it's in the chat or something, following up this session, which is on transparency, one of the things that Katherine mentioned. Do things like signing up to our newsletter if you're not being in touch with us before, and then you get a feel of what we're up to. And then, I mean, the last thing obviously is to thank all of you, those who just listened, those who asked questions. Thank you for being here, and to Katherine and Neil, thank you for a fantastic couple of presentations and answering all the questions in a great manner. So hopefully see you all again soon. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.